We'll get. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about the chapter on organizational structure, which I always found to be an interesting subject. The There's a distinction in the management field between organizational behavior, which is the subject of this class, and it tends to be psychological or social psychology kind of thing. So you talk about stuff like individual traits, and personality we talked about, and we talked about emotions, and it extends into group behavior. So teams and leadership is part of it too. So it's not individual psychology, although that's part of it, but it's also social psychology. So groups and motivation is a big part of it. So that's the usual content of OB. And then there's like overlap. The sister subject is OT, organizational theory. And that's more the subject that we're going to talk about tonight, which is how organizations are structured and how they interact with the environment. So in the management field, they would call this kind of thing more macro in nature. It's a different meaning. Well, it's the same meaning, but a different application from macroeconomics and economics versus microeconomics. In economics, when they talk about macro and micro, they're talking about the economy as an entire aggregate versus the economy viewed in terms of individuals and firms, which is microeconomics. Labor economics kind of spans the two, but it's a little bit closer to micro. Although at times labor economists get into macroeconomic issues too. In management, the field divides between the behavior of individuals and groups in the organization versus the organization as a whole. So organizational structure would be the organization as a whole, and so that would be part of OT, organizational theory versus organizational behavior. I think it's an interesting topic, and one that has applications in my own field, which is HR, human resource management, which is often thought to be connected more to OB. Most people would say, "Oh, HR is a part of OB," and in fact, the book goes into HR in the later chapters. I'm not going to cover it because I teach a separate course in HR, and there may be people in the class who've had me for that. It's pointless to duplicate, and we have enough material as it is. So basically, tonight we're going to talk about more the company as a whole, rather than how individuals interact with the company and like the company and the environment. And this material is more influenced by sociology than by psychology. Stuff like emotions and personality, those kind of subjects that we talked about in the beginning were more psychological. And the material kind of gravitated towards the more group-oriented stuff like motivation and leadership, conflict, and a subject like conflict, I think, can be individual psychology, but it can also be sociological. And organization theory is more sociological in nature. Just to give you an overview there, it's not critical to anything practical, but just to tell you how things are evolving. I mean, not things are evolving, like how things are structured in academia. So basically, a lot of this material harkens back to the 20th century, which to some of you is alien. There are probably people in the group that never even lived in the 20th century, where I spent 2/3 of my life. But not that these things don't exist now, but they're not as dominant as they were 20 years ago. And in particular, your book has been talking about how America is emerging as a gig economy. So it's becoming more like a series of movie productions that are not made by the old-fashioned studio system, but made by the more of the modern kind of adhocracy that where a firm works together with another firm and they hire people ad hoc and basically create a movie as a unit just for that one movie. Your book calls that virtual organization structure. And I think the world is kind of following that. That transition in Hollywood took place in the 1960s and 70s. You saw the death of the, and when they made 12 O'Clock High, which I assigned to you, was before I was born. And that was still Darryl F. Zanuck was who produced that, was the, one of the icons of the studio system. And he was the founder of 20th Century Fox, which is now, I guess 21st Century Fox, related to Fox Television and all the rest. It was bought out, of course, by Rupert Murdoch, and the nature of it changed. But basically, the way that organizations are structured are going in this direction of the virtual organization and away from the old-fashioned hierarchical. And I think when I talked about communication, I mentioned the reason that technology changes the mode of communication. It changes a lot, and we're not always aware of how things are changing. Like, I think part of the stupefaction of political conversation in America is due to the rise of social media. I don't have to go into it in detail, but I think this kind of very short-term staccato thinking is less penetrating and less capable of important insights or serious thought than old-fashioned modes of thinking involving linear kinds of analysis, mathematics, longer essays and books and things like that require much more mental concentration. Any kind of important insight is the result of intensive concentration. Social media doesn't produce that. So I think, many decades ago, a guy named Marshall McLuhan said that the medium is the message. And basically, I think the nature of the message has changed considerably with the advent of social media and cell phone technology. But one of the results of that evolution is that there's no longer really a need for organizations to the same degree that they once were needed. I recall I worked for two major corporations when I was in my early to late 20s. One was International Nickel Corporation, which is now a subsidiary of Valet Corp. At the time, it had about 35,000 employees, and it was the dominant nickel producer in the free world. Of course, what's now called Norilsk Nickel in Russia was bigger, I think, but they didn't supply us readily. And the second one was Johnson and Johnson, which you all know about. And the two organizations had drastically different structures. J&J was bigger, but I don't think that was really the reason. The reason was more technological and task related. That, in other words, a large mining company has relatively simple operations. They've got big mines and they've got thousands of workers in those mines all doing one thing. Whereas J&J to this day grows by acquisition, and they focus on health-related issues, but within that strategic vision of health, there's enormous range of competencies required in areas ranging from technology to manufacturing Band-Aids to home health care to making dentures and all kinds of other things, Tylenol and birth control pills and so innovative drugs and so on. So these different firms have drastically different kinds of business strategies, different kinds of personnel. And so because of the huge diversity at J&J, they early on devised a decentralized form of organization, which we'll talk about. Whereas INCO, International Nickel Company, had a centralized or functional form of organization. And so the reasons for it were rooted in the kinds of businesses they were in. Your book doesn't go into the development of the ideas. It gives a very good overview of the concepts in the field. And most of it is of a useful nature that if you're thinking of designing a company or trying to understand how a company is set up, the material in chapter 15 is useful. The thing is, though, that companies like INCO and J&J, while still important in the economy, are becoming less important. And America is more and more focusing on work that is part of the gig economy. 35% of the workforce, or 57 million Americans, did some freelance work in 2019. And the number is growing. I myself, through my career, have a number of times done freelance work. I worked as an expert witness a number of times and other things. And basically, I think it's become fairly standard for people not to work in these large corporations the way they did in the 1950s and 60s. So, and it was continuing in the 70s. When I went to work at INCO in 75, I sort of had this thing in my mind, oh, it's like the 60s, even then it was changing. So anyway, to understand organization, you look at the way the concept of organizational structure was developed. A big part of it came from a historian named Alfred Chandler, who wrote a book called Strategy and Structure. And in the book, he studies 4 corporations, does case studies of their development. And the first one is General Motors, also DuPont and Sears Roebuck. And what he shows in these case studies is that a single theme could be observed, which is that structure follows strategy. That, in other words, the structure of the companies evolved in response to the kind of business strategy they pursued. And in most cases, American companies were gravitating at that time in the 1950s towards the decentralized form of organization. And if you read that email I sent around, and the reason was straightforward, that the complexity of a large corporation is simply too great to manage from the top. And so a company like J&J has so many different cultures and tasks and technologies that any one person would be unable or have a difficult time to manage them. In the 1960s, there was a guy named Harold Janine who ran a company called IT&T, which I think still exists, but it's been downsized considerably. And what Janine was a genius who was also very astute politically and was famous for some of his international dealings and political dealings, but he was able to manage hugely diverse industries such as hotels, technology, electronics, and so on, and was able to single-handedly manage these hugely diverse businesses. When he left, the firm did not perform well. So in the 70s, consulting firms like the Boston Consulting Group talked about focusing on a core strategy. In the 80s, I forget the author, there was a famous article, the core competence of the corporation. And the idea was that companies should do what they're best at, identify the things that they're world-class at and do those things. And so this was the exact opposite of what the same consulting firms had been advising them to do in the 1960s, which was to diversify. So you treat the company like a portfolio of businesses. Of course, if you have a portfolio of businesses, it's going to lead to decentralization. Like the leading example of that is Berkshire Hathaway, which is really not a company. I mean, you can buy the stock, but it's really more of a mutual fund that is overseen by Warren Buffett. But basically, the companies run themselves. He might occasionally have a hand in the management, but even though Berkshire owns a lot of the companies outright, not all, but a lot of them outright, and he often will have a hand in the management. He lets the managements run themselves. Of course, he's not above getting deeply involved with a company if he thinks it's worth his time. I think one of the major examples of that was the Washington Post, which he was on the board, and when the owner, who's the husband of the woman who inherited it, basically Catherine Graham, when he committed suicide, Buffett kind of mentored Catherine Graham, and she became known as one of the best executives in American history, with the help, of course, coming from someone who had never worked in industry. But usually Buffett, he'll let the companies run themselves, but he specializes in judging people. And a lot of what he does is when he buys a company is assess the management to see, are they honest? Are they good people? Are they the kind of people he'd want to do business with? And he says that he often won't have more than a one-page contract, which is astonishing, given I was just talking to a guy who developed an apartment building in Jersey City. And he told me that the contract he wrote with his fellow developers was 1,000 pages long. So this contrasts sharply with Buffett, but not everyone is as astute as Buffett. And for some reason, he's got really excellent human radar. I don't myself. I don't know how he does it, but he does. So anyway, organization structure is the way that jobs are formally divided, grouped, and coordinated. And really, as I said in the communications section of the course, organizations are in many ways communication vehicles. If you look back in time, a big part of the reason why Rome conquered much of the Mediterranean region and into far-off lands like Turkey and, from them, I mean, France and so on, was that they were able to organize their army in a more sophisticated way than their enemies or competitors, whatever you want to call them. And so they used chain of command, where each level had 10 reports. So you could, with 4 levels, you could reach 10,000 people, 10 to the 4th. And so they could quickly communicate, and this facilitated military strategy. The people they were fighting were not as sophisticated, not as civilized as they were, and it took them many centuries to catch up. Eventually they did, and hence the fall of Rome. So basically, some of the areas that structure and organizational design touch on include things like, and I'm talking about Exhibit 15-1 in your textbook, the subdivision of work. So this idea of this specialization goes back to Adam Smith and earlier. And basically, Smith gave the example of a pin factory. And he said, whereas in earlier generations, a single individual making pins could maybe make a few a day doing all the work themselves. But if you specialize the work, they could make many hundreds of pins a day. Within a few decades after Smith, as this idea caught on and led to increased mechanization as well, the number increased exponentially. I don't know how many pins a pin factory can make in a day now, but it's probably many times greater than. You don't need human intervention anymore, for one thing. And so, the number increased exponentially. And contrary to what most social critics claim through the centuries, for the last 400 years, this did not lead to a loss of jobs. It led to different kinds of jobs that were less demanding and less dangerous and less stressful than had existed previously. And it also, of course, resulted in declining death rates and increasing standards of living until, I think, the last 20 years. And this should give you pause, those of you who see what's happened in the last 20 years as progressive. I don't think it has been. So basically, the subdivision of work and specialization, departmentalization, if you will, is a big part of organizational structure, grouping tasks as well. And this, again, is somewhat under, let's say, erosion due to the advent of technology, which is the chain of command. As I just mentioned, in the Roman army, they were able to defeat dozens and dozens of other cultures and civilizations because they had superior chain of command, which served as a communication tool. In today's organizations, the larger ones have to have some element of chain of command. But as your book points out, what happened in the 80s, and it began in the 70s and earlier, but certainly it escalated in the 80s and 90s, was downsizing. And the reason for downsizing was improved technology. They didn't have cell phones in the 80s, but they had, they already were having things like faxing and the beginnings of email in the 90s and so on. And this greatly enhanced downsizing. As well, what you also had was the beginnings of the lean management system. And the origins of that were in Toyota. The concept of lean manufacturing came from Toyota, and the inventor was a guy named Taiichi Ohno, who brought the idea to the Toyota family with a D. It's spelled a little differently. And they allowed him to pursue this. He later wrote a book about it and he sort of bragged about it, and they got mad at him and got rid of him. But basically, it was his idea. And the idea in lean manufacturing is that you do away with inventory. So he said he got the idea for it when he visited America for the first time after World War II and saw Western supermarkets that were unknown in Japan. They're still not that prevalent in Japan. They haven't pursued distribution as aggressively as we have. But basically, he realized that you could treat inventory control as that the worker is the one that decides what inventory to have. And so they're given a list of assigned inventory and they pick it up. And it's delivered, that list is given to the parts suppliers, and they supply the parts that the workers then pick up. So you clear the market every day and they just have the inventory they need. And he wrote this wonderful book, Toyota Production System, which is, if you're at all interested in production problems or in any kind of management, it's it's truly a great book. It's not often quoted in school, but it's truly a great book. So basically, the structure of organizations, when I worked at J&J, when I made the transition, I worked at Enco, I went to business school, MBA, and then I went to J&J. And when I worked there, I started thinking to myself, you really don't need a corporation. You could have individual contracting. And I was unaware, I hadn't got my PhD yet, so I hadn't read this, was that a guy named Ronald Coase had asked that question in the 1930s and said, asked, why do you need organizations? And his answer was one of economy, that, in other words, the costs and benefits of organizing will determine the size of a corporation and whether or not you organize. And so part of it is if there's more vehicles for communication available, then you won't need as large organizations, because a lot of what organizations do is facilitate communication. So as things like Zoom and the internet and cell phones have become available, there's been less need for organizational structure, and hence the downsizing of the organizations. So basically, stuff like reporting relationships have been flattened. Back in the 60s, it was assumed that you wanted to have a span of control. A span of control means how many employees report to a given supervisor. You wanted to have a span of control of like 5 to 8 per manager. I was just talking to my students in my Business 3200 class this afternoon, and somebody gave a presentation, and he said that in his company, his boss has 60 people reporting to him, 60, compared to when I was a manager, I had 8 at City Federal. I moved on to a bank, and I had 8 reports, and that was considered normal. And this guy, has 60. So basically, that's facilitated by changes in communication and control systems. So you don't really need as much supervision as you once did. A big question in organizational structure is the matter of centralization versus decentralization. And I've already kind of explained that as organizations become more complex, you need more decentralization. And this idea was really invented by the founding fathers of the United States, in particular, James Madison, who recognized that you can avert the natural forces that generate tyrannies in a republic. And they were well aware of the fall of the Roman Republic and the horrors that came out of Greek democracy. And they were not unthinking fans of democracy, because they knew there were serious problems with democracy that we're beginning to witness now. But basically, one of the huge advantages, which was recognized by de Tocqueville in his masterwork, Democracy in America, one of the truly brilliant books ever written about America, and also about how to organize government, is that administration is not the same as policy. Policy and administration are two different things. And de Tocqueville realized that separating administration from policy limits tyranny. But on top of that, it's far more efficient to have localized control over administration, because the problems of a locale are usually not well understood by central authority, which is part of the reason why central planning and socialism have repeatedly failed and are incapable of success, especially in a large nation. So basically, decentralization is a way to manage information, and it's a way to simplify the execution and development of strategy, which we'll talk about later if we have time. There's also the issue of formalization. The thinker who invented the concept of bureaucracy was Max Weber. And I mentioned him in conjunction with our discussion of charisma, which he also discussed in the same context. That, in other words, he saw these as alternative sources of authority. And basically, bureaucracy is legitimate because it is efficient. And Weber, of course, was German, and he had as his model the emergence of large companies in Bismarckian Germany in the late 19th century. And I think that culture is really perfect. It's a culture that puts a lot of weight on technology and on engineering and on rationality, and I think that fit really well. What happened in America as we adopted bureaucracy, a sociologist named Robert Merton, by the 1940s, recognized that bureaucracy kind of led to ritualization, that the bureaucrats tend to fetishize rules, and the rules became an end in themselves. And so and this was in a really beautiful sociology article in the 1940s. And basically, this insight, of course, is now commonplace. It's not news to us that bureaucrats often become obsessed with their own power and also with the rules. And you can see in the public that often the public becomes fixated on the rules as ends to themselves, and it becomes a source of assurance and security to know that there are these rules and controls in place. And so, but if you're a competitive corporation, this kind of fixation, this kind of religion based on rules that, oh, we're going to follow the rules, is self-destructive, because the real world changes constantly, and rules are often out of date by the time they're published. And so formalization has limits, and a lot of the limits are that evolve because there's progress. So people who are fixated on regulation and rules tend to be actually anti-progressive, although they frequently characterize themselves as progressive. They're actually anti-progressive because rules and regulations are rendered out of date by evolution of technology, science, and economic thinking, and what business strategies do by the time they're published. I mean, the bureaucracy just is out of date. So it's kind of like a fruitless effort to regulate things that have changed so quickly. So basically, firms that are able to do away with formalization will tend to outperform those that are excessively formalized. Government it has to be formalized because politicians are corrupt and incompetent, and so a major step forward for government was the passage of the Pendleton Act in the late 19th century, which reformed civil service. and created rigid bureaucracies in government. So that before that, hiring of government employees was corrupt. Whoever worked for the politician, if you worked for Tammany Hall, you were appointed to be a police officer. And there was nothing that really worked well. So this kind of bureaucratization, which was copied probably from Germany, was an improvement in government. And in business too, the business executives were still rooted in medieval thinking in the 19th century, and they didn't realize that you need to base things on equity and on contracts and on fairness, and so they would often treat their employees abusively and or paternalistically, and so you didn't have the kind of relations that would lead to fluid non-formal organizations. The non-formality of the 19th century was often one-sided or unfair. But what happened was that the Japanese created a more sophisticated form of management, where they combined it with the lean manufacturing I was just talking about with Deming and his ideas of total quality management. But they also adopted a set of HR policies that eliminated firing. So, you know, when you looked at the big Japanese companies after the war, not before the war. So it wasn't that they were Confucian and therefore adopted these fair policies because they had kind of a cultural attitude, but rather it was a conscious strategy to create an environment for employees where they didn't feel threatened. And so they could voice their concerns with management and expect to remain in the firm and be fairly treated. And so this combined like a set of bureaucratic rules, but with far more rigid restraints on top management than has ever existed in America. And the result was that there was much less need for formalization than there had been. And so this huge amount of flexibility, and if you want to read a book about it, was written in the early 1980s by William Ouchi, Ouchi, called Theory Z. And he talks about the culture and HR policies of the Japanese companies of that time, which have carried forward to a degree. Now, unfortunately, this did not extend to Japan as a whole or to their government, just because Toyota and Honda and Kyocera were well managed and had adopted intelligent policies, doesn't mean that the entire government of Japan was a model for the US. There were claims about that time. Robert Reich in particular wrote a ridiculous book about it, saying the US should adopt this kind of central planning method. What happened was that immediately after that book was published, that there was a crash in the Japanese stock and real estate markets, from which the country hasn't recovered in 35 years. It's been literally 30 years of stagnation there, with almost no economic growth and huge amounts of money printing and jobs unavailable to youngsters and so on. And it's been a complete disaster, which was a direct result of the Ministry of Trade, their MIDI, so saying that their success in the 70s and 80s was due to their central planning is completely laughable. They've had nothing but disaster in the last 30 years. So basically, this idea, though, that you can have fluid organizations is very important. And towards the end of the chapter, your book goes into like the organic versus the mechanistic form of organization. And there's no doubt in my mind that organizations need to move towards ever greater fluidity. And they're going to, because the technology is going to keep advancing, and the ability to communicate easily will keep advancing. The cost of contracting is going to be reduced. So my original thought when I worked at J&J in the early 80s, why not just have a lot of people contracting with each other? Actually, I think will sooner or later not be totally achieved, but we'll be moving in that direction for a long time. And so basically, issues like the chain of command are important, and they continue to be, but I see them as becoming less important over time. So the idea of the chain of command is that there's a line of authority, and unity of command means that one person should have one and only one supervisor, and also that you communicate upward. But even in the time of Fayot, who was an important a management theorist of the early 20th century, was a French industrialist who was an early pioneer in discussing organizational structure, described what's known as Fayot's bridge. So basically, I'll put this on the screensaver. If I can find the screensaver. Oh, there it is. I see some chat questions. Oh, yes, the 23rd issue. IT&T still exists. Thank you, Stephen. Okay, Brian, I read you. Okay, now let's get to the 23rd question. I said last class that the thing would be due the 23rd, so that's days. I'm not going to change my promise. So basically, the thing is due the 23rd, the discussion board. So I apologize if I didn't realize I had written the 20th. I slipped my mind. So basically, the 23rd is the due date. So you don't have to worry if that's what you were thinking of. Okay. Are there any questions about that?
Wait, you said the discussion board is due the 23rd now?
Oh, not
The paper, you mean, right?
The paper.
Okay.
Right. Okay. No more discussion boards. We're finished with those. The paper is due the 23rd. Okay. Are there any questions about that or anything? Any problems?
I have a question about the exam. When's the exam? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, it's on the syllabus. I'm going to give you the take-home exam on the I think it's the 4th, is it? I'll post it. That's next week is Thanksgiving. So it's the Sunday after Thanksgiving, and it will be due the 11th. Okay.
On the syllabus you wrote, it was due the 15th.
The 15th, that's correct. Yeah, sorry about that. Another mistake. So it's due the 15th. We will have, there is, the class continues on to the 11th, but it will be an optional session. So we'll talk about something practical of interest to you. We can talk about like investing, or there were people who were interested in doing a Zoom session on investing. Maybe we could talk about that. So, or something else if other people are interested in something else. So that'll be an optional class on the 11th. So the last requirement.
Maybe we can all just watch a movie together.
What?
Sorry.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get you.
Maybe we can all watch a movie together, like in Kanto.
Yeah, the problem with that, I have nothing against that, but in fact, I've tried a number of times. Amazon does not allow movies to be shown on Zoom. So anything, most of my movies are on Amazon Prime, and when I try to show them, they won't show on Zoom. So if you have a way to show a movie, we could do that and discuss it. That's a nice idea. We could certainly do that. But I have to have a way to show it other than Amazon Prime. You know, in my live class this afternoon, we watched a video that I tried to show last semester on, it's for a different class, not for this class, that I tried to show on Zoom, and it didn't work. It wouldn't play. I've had that problem with every video I've tried to show, and I realized that they just have a block on it. It's not due to any kind of malfunction. So we've got to find another way if we want to watch a movie. So that might be something to think about. So I'll give out the take-home exam on the 4th. It is due 11 days later on the 15th. There will be an optional class on the 11th. And on the 4th, we're going to discuss organizational culture. The paper is due on the 23rd. Okay. Any other questions about that stuff? No, I guess silence means no. All right, so maybe at this point I'll take attendance. Brian said that he's having trouble with his phone, so I'll give him.
I'm here, Professor.
Okay, great. Okay, I got you.
Thanks. So we could go after tennis or stay?
What's that?
Stay or go?
I didn't quite hear that.
Do we stay after you take attendance or go?
Oh, no, stay, please stay. Yeah, I'm taking
Okay.
attendance in the middle. You're eager to go. You can't wait. Minhas Ahmed.
Yeah, that's me. I'm here.
Okay. Muez. Muez? Muez? Okay, we got some letters. Okay, Dana Blakarova. Karina.
Good night, Professor. I'm here.
Good, Karina. Derek.
Hello.
Okay, Jalin.
Here, Professor.
Thank you. Naisha Sherry.
Here.
Thank you. Charles DeGross.
Here.
Thank you.
Professor, did you call my name?
I did, Moez.
You got me?
I do. I have you now.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Charles is here. Tyler. Tyler Daly. Okay. Caitlin. Caitlin. Caitlin was here in the beginning. Reham.
Here.
Thank you. Fatima.
Here.
Got your paper back?
Yeah, I received it.
Good.
Thank you.
Joseanne. Joseanne Frazier. Raquel.
Here, Josephine Fraser.
Joseanne Frazier's here.
Yes.
Okay. Raquel Gray.
Here.
Thank you. Gabrielle.
Gabrielle, I'm here.
Gabrielle, yes. Brian, I got. Maimuna. Kabir. Maimuna. Steve.
Yeah, I am here.
Salma. Selma Kahanam. Catherine Kim.
Here.
Clinton Kenyeti. Clinton.
Here.
Thank you. Ilya.
I'm here.
Billy.
Hi, Professor. I'm here.
Excellent. Christina Kuchenko. Shanice Lawson. Alex Lee.
Hi, Professor. I'm here.
Hello. Ava Luke.
I'm here.
Hello. Lisbeth Martinez.
Here, Professor.
Thank you, Lisbeth. Kevin. Okay.
Here, Professor.
Are you here? Okay. Barbara,
Hello, Professor. I'm here.
thank you. Leonie.
I'm here, Professor.
you.
You got me, Professor? Sorry. Kevin?
Yeah, I got you.
Oh,
Kevin.
okay. Sorry, I wasn't sure. It's like
No
my mute button's busted. I
Okay,
guess it's not.
no problem. Jacqueline,
Hi, Professor, I'm here.
thank you. Judy,
Hi, I'm here.
thank you. Jessica,
Hi, I'm here.
thank you. Oriana. Oriana Mora. Okay, Hamza.
Here.
Thank you. Anthony,
Here.
thank you, Anthony. Diana. Owusu,
Yeah, Professor.
thank you. Sabita,
I'm here, Professor.
thank you. Sapir. Sapir Rafaelov. Shakira Risher,
I'm here, Professor.
Eliza Silks.
Here.
Okay. Dixuan Su,
Here.
thank you. Nahima Sultana,
Hi, Professor. I'm here.
good. Rayvon Watson Taylor,
I'm here.
thank you, Rayvon. Michael Williams,
I'm here, Professor.
thank you, Michael. Ben Wu,
I'm here.
thank you, Ben. Yang Yue Wu,
I'm here.
thank you, and Asen Yagladir.
I'm here.
Okay, I'm just gonna read the names of the people marked absent. If you hear your name and I call you, please let me know that you're here. Dana, Caitlin, Maimuna.
I'm here, Professor.
Okay, Maimuna, thank you. Uh, Christina Kuchenko, Oriana Mora, and Sapir Rafaelov. Okay, so let me get back to what I was talking about. So basically, the idea that you structure the organization appropriate to the firm's strategy, and that that those kinds of decisions are modified by the task required of the organization, the technology required, the pace of innovation, and environmental factors, which we'll talk about. Causes companies to adopt different kinds of organizational structures. So if you look at like an entrepreneurial type organization, putting this on the I hope you can see this on the screen share.
Yes.
Okay, so basically you have yeah, maybe this will work better. So you have like an entrepreneur, and in a simple structure, everybody reports to the entrepreneur. So, you might have, 5 employees. And they all, it doesn't matter what they do, like you own a restaurant, so you have like a cook, a bartender, a waiter, waitress, janitor, whatever. Okay, Shanice is here. I get it. Okay, so Shanice. So basically they all report to the one person. How do I get rid of this? So that's appropriate for a very small outfit, and it works fine if you have, let's say, 20 or fewer employees. The danger is that the entrepreneur becomes a bottleneck. You see this in a lot of small organizations that are ready to catapult into a larger size. And the entrepreneur just can't delegate to lower ranking people. And so all decisions continue to go through the entrepreneur. And what that does is it stifles the company from growing. A good manager, not all good entrepreneurs are good managers. Some have the sense to move on and start another business because they're good at doing that, but they're not good at managing a growing business. A lot of the key to managing a business is setting up a structure. Like, I think part of the issue with this thing, FTX, that has been in the news lately, I forget the name of the guy that founded it, but he's obviously a talented entrepreneur, is very brilliant, but he had no concept of how to manage an organization. I was reading in the Wall Street Journal this morning about this firm, and he had a girlfriend or a friend, I think she was his part-time girlfriend, and she was running the company for him, and neither of them had a clue as to how to structure an organization, and they didn't keep the books, and there was no HR department, and so there was just complete chaos. And so they were running an organization that had immense financial obligations in the billions, and yet they were running it like somebody who had just founded a company and had no clue as to how to do it. And this is going to get you into trouble, needless to say. So entrepreneurs have to learn how to mature. Someone who did that very well was Bill Gates, which is part of why he's so successful. We often think of the deals he made with IBM and with DOS, and how that morphed into stealing Windows from Steve Jobs, and the important technological breakthroughs that Microsoft developed in the ensuing years. But it was also true that Gates had a clear idea of how to manage. He may not have figured out the best way to structure Microsoft. Your book talks about that a little, but it's been reasonably well managed and professionally managed the whole time. If you look at FTX, which is like your generation's Enron, basically, it was complete chaos, complete incompetence, and that's what happens. So basically, bureaucracy was a step towards elaborating on the simple form of organization. And what the idea of bureaucracy that Weber first recognized is that there's a chain of command, there are fixed jobs, there's a fixed salary, there are rules and regulations. No one officer has the authority to make personnel decisions without approval. And this kind of thing led to more sophisticated organizational structures. So basically, the two, as I said earlier, the two most important ones are the, how do I clear this? It used to be like a clear thing. All right, it gives an eraser. You want to make it more like a blackboard or something. Okay. So in the functional form of organization, which is appropriate to relatively simple corporations, like I said, like International Nickel, which was basically just a handful of industries doing roughly the same thing. You know, they were in different kinds of mining and metal fabrication. So you have a CEO, and the CEO has reporting to them, you know, a few. I'm not doing this too well, but you get the idea. A few basic departments. So, you know, you have HR, you know, so I'm having a little trouble navigating this with my laptop. So you have like HR, you have marketing, let's use this one. Marketing, I can't do that. You have finance, manufacturing, etc. And each one has a vice president. Sorry, I'm not making these lines better. It's hard, it's awkward for me to do this. And they all have reports. So each function reports to the CEO. And that's called a functional form of organization. And this works well with relatively simple. When I say simple, I mean you're not doing a lot of different stuff. It could be a big company, like it could be like a huge company like JP Morgan Chase, but all they do is banking. So you could set up, you know, operations, HR, marketing, finance, and you know, it could cover the entire firm. And there won't be a lot of confusion because it's one thing. It's not so, the size doesn't really change it a lot. I mean, whether you have a bank with 2,000 employees or a bank with 200,000 employees, it's basically the same problems. It's just they're more elaborate in a bigger bank. So it's a simple kind of organization. But you know, if you go into the more conglomerate type things like J&J or IT&T, then you need some kind of federal form. So this is what Chandler wrote about in Strategy and Structure, how this form had been adopted by a lot of the leading corporations. So, you know, if you take GM as an example, so you have like the CEO of GM was a guy named Alfred Sloan in the 1930s and 40s. And he's the one who created this structure. And then reporting to him directly was his head of R&D, research and development, who was named Kettering. So you may have heard of the Sloan Kettering Hospital. Sloan himself was quite wealthy because he had a huge amount of General Motors stock when it became the largest car company. And he actually lived in the city, although his job was in Detroit. lived in the city after he retired, and he funded the cancer hospital, Sloan Kettering, using his and his friend Kettering's name. And Kettering was an important inventor who invented things like the turnkey engine and many other things, the modern locomotive, all kinds of stuff that came from him. So basically, you had this kind of staff organizations that reported directly to the CEO, but didn't have a lot of line authority. You'd also have stuff like, also here, I'll use that box. I don't know what the heck I'm doing here. You also had like stuff like legal regulations, finance, all of that reported directly to the CEO. Back in those days, GM's finance department was here in New York, even though the manufacturing was in Detroit. I give up. I'm not able to navigate that thing. So basically, that was a whole building. It's still there. The building is there. It was on 59th and 5th, that tall white building. I think it might be Apple Computer now or something like that. But basically, that was the GM finance department at one time. And so that kind of staff function reported to him, but then he divisionalized everything else. And he got the idea. What he did was he said Ford Motor Company was dominating the low-end cars. They had something called the Model T, which was they cost in today's dollars about $3,000 a car in today's dollars. So in those days it was like 200 or something. And so basically he said that Ford's dominating the low end of the car market. So we're not going to try to compete with them. What we're going to try to do is compete in every segment at the high end of the price. We're going to divide the car market into 5 segments. Each segment will compete at the high end of the segment. And then we're going to make the cars of sufficient quality, which the Model Ts weren't. They weren't of good quality. And we're going to make the cars of sufficient quality that after someone drives them for a few years, they can sell them as used cars. So he basically invented the concept of the used car market that has gotten so much publicity lately. And so basically the 5 divisions were Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac. And at each segment, they competed at the high end of the price spectrum within the segment. And the idea was that you get the more affluent consumers in each segment to buy the GM cars and then sell them used to lower end consumers in competition with the Model Ts. So basically, this was Sloan's approach to divisionalization. J&J, it's more radical in that, but at J&J, there's a much wider range of products. And this kind of product departmentalization is very common. Now, an alternative form of organization is called the matrix organization. It has nothing to do with the movies, although they're good movies. But the matrix organization creates dual authority. I'm not going to try that whiteboard again. I didn't have good luck with it. But basically, in a matrix organization, there's both functional and product departmentalization at the same time. So it doesn't have to be that, but you can picture, let's say, your book gives an academic example, and I'll follow suit. Let's say I work for the business department. So my quote unquote supervisor is the head of the business department. And James Lynch is his name. And if Professor Lynch wants me to teach a class, I salute and say, yes, sir, and I teach it. and this is normal for an organization with a departmentalized structure. But let's say they need a task force to like develop a business school strategic plan, or there's a college-wide committee that needs to discuss the facilities or some such thing. In that case, there might be a cross-departmental team headed by somebody else. So in effect, I report to that person, if I'm on that committee, I report to that person as well as to Professor Lynch. So that would be a kind of matrix organization. So in other words, you report, I'm an HR person, but I'm working on the Hoover Dam project, whatever that is. So I work for some big construction company. What's this one I'm thinking of? I work for some big construction company, and I report to the HR vice president, but they put me on the Hoover Dam project where I've got to supervise Hoover Dam construction employees. So the head of the Hoover Dam project is somebody else. It's someone from the operations department. So for a while, I report to two people, the head of the Hoover Dam project and the head of HR. And so that violates one of the principles of organization structure, which is that there be unity of command, that you only have one boss reporting, and that's inherent in a matrix organization. And that can at times be disadvantageous because you can get conflicting demands from the two bosses. But the reason it is so advantageous is that when there is a need for some kind of impromptu, some kind of sudden development, you can use the matrix structure to organize a quick response. And so it has a greater degree of flexibility than a pure functional organization. A lot of really good companies have used the matrix organization approach. Your book points out quite rightly, there was a guy named James Bryan Quinn 30 years ago, I think. Now it's hard to believe for me, but I remember when his book came out, and it was really new to me. I felt like, wow, it was out of school already. It's like, this is really groundbreaking. But basically, it's been around for a long time, and it's nothing new that a lot of companies are evolving towards virtual organizations, where there's a small core organization that outsources its major functions. I mentioned earlier the Hollywood example, that they evolved away from the studio system of Darryl F. Zanuck, where the stars were contracted, or all the actors were contracted and long-term employees, to one where there's a great deal of flexibility. Different production companies get involved in making a single movie, and the people who make a given movie never see each other again. Possibly, maybe they do it by accident, but there's no real connection after that movie is finished. It's been around for a long time. One of the ideas that I was talking about Alfred Sloan and his path-breaking development of the product divisionalization. He also, another thing he did was invent the use of franchises for selling cars, which of course was copied later by Ray Kroc at McDonald's and elsewhere. The actual inventor of the franchise concept was none other than Benjamin Franklin, who was a great genius of extraordinary capacity in many areas. And he himself was, I don't know how much wealth, I don't know if anyone knows exactly how much wealth he accumulated, but it was for that time, it was very big. And part of the reason was he created this franchise concept that he had developed a print shop. He had worked as a lad as a printer, and he started his own. And in those days, printers were also publishers. The distinction in today's world didn't exist back then. And he then got the idea to set up a chain of print shops that he'd sell to people in different locations. And so he could get them to do the work and make a living, and he would get a share of the profit for showing them how to do it. And so he was like, he may have been the inventor of franchising, but it was utilized brilliantly by Sloan in the development of the way that cars are sold to this day. So when you go to, say, a Chevy dealer, they have a franchise from the manufacturer. The dealer is not the same one. That his interests are different from the manufacturer, but they're closely tied together. And part of the reason for that is that a lot of the problems of dealerships are remote. You know, it's a great way to decentralize, really. So you're hollowing out that set of duties to somebody else who's highly motivated because they've got a lot at stake. They've got a lot of financial investment in the franchise, and so they're going to be highly motivated to maximize sales. And the car company needn't be burdened with that divergent set of problems. In a hollow form of organization, of virtual organization, only the non-critical functions are outsourced. So IBM did that. They got rid of their HR department, for example. They had a famous HR department that was very expensive, and they outsourced it and told them, you've got to survive on your own and become a profit center on your own. In the modular form of virtual organization, key product components are outsourced. Those of you who like Nike sneakers, for example, will know that is the type. And today with globalization, what a lot of companies did was hire Chinese firms to do the manufacturing. So they would retain the planning and product development, give the blueprint to a Chinese company that in turn would do the manufacturing. And so this has a lot to do with globalization. Your book talks about another idea, which I think is probably more form than substance, called the circular organization. If you can picture a hierarchy, there's a boss at the top, and everybody does what the boss says, and there's some levels down. Now, what the circular organization does is it flattens it so that the boss is then at the center, and it's more of a collegial type thing. But my experience in academia is that this type of setup isn't really that different. That what it does is it creates some ambiguity, but there's still people who are, you still have the boss. The boss doesn't go away. And, if you watch the video, a very good video on YouTube called The Deep Dive, which is about a firm called IDEO, I-D-E-O. And the innovation, they're still around. It's a well-known design firm run by a guy named Kelly. And basically, they have this kind of structure that, in other words, he's the boss, there's no question, but he gives everyone, it's collegial, and he gives everyone a lot of authority, and a lot of decisions are made laterally rather than top down. But ultimately, he's still the boss. So I think there's probably something to be said for the circular form of organization, but I don't know that it really, it's really changing the traditional hierarchy that much. All right, so your textbook mentions that the trend has been away, which I already said, has been away from the mechanistic model toward the organic model of organizational design. Organic structures are flatter, they're more cross-hierarchical, they have less formalization, they have more participative decision-making, and that's all good stuff. Now, your book also talks a little bit about strategy, and we still have a few minutes left, so I'll go into a bit on that. the most important writer on the subject of business strategy is a guy named Michael Porter, who wrote a book called Competitive Strategy. I assume you're going to get this material in other classes, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But basically, there's a lot of overlap between what Porter says and what your book says, but your book frames it in different language. Your book also integrates the ideas of a pair of guys named Miles and Snow, who talked about a typology of business strategies. So it kind of combines these two approaches. And basically what Porter said is that there are certain environmental forces, and your book goes into a lot of them. Your book talks about 3 broad characteristics of the environment: capacity, volatility, and complexity. And basically capacity is how much growth is possible, volatility is how much instability, and complexity is how many different variables, how much heterogeneity and dispersion of environmental elements. And so basically what Porter said is that the business environment of the firm largely shapes the way the firm has to compete. And there are a lot of variables that affect businesses. Your book mentions institutional theory, which says, and I think there's a lot of truth to it, that firms often don't think so much strategically as imitatively. That institutional thinking claims that a lot of what goes on in society is based on imitation and habit, rather than on economic variables or optimizing economic returns. And of course, this is true. The one who created these ideas was an economist named Thorstein Veblen, who lived in the early 20th century and had numerous important insights that are often echoed into this time. And I can't go into everything he said, but he put a lot of weight on imitation and habituation. And one of his books, The Theory of the Leisure Class, goes into, he invented the term conspicuous consumption, the idea that people consume in order to impress others, not to satisfy their own needs. And in a book called The Instinct of Workmanship, he argued that there are basically 2 classes of people in society. So the aristocrats, who are financiers in our world, and the serfs, who are basically engineers. The book was called The Engineers and the Price System. And basically he said that most progress comes from the engineers, but everything is owned by the financiers. And so he favored a kind of an overthrow, a technocracy ruled by engineers. It's kind of interesting stuff, but the world hasn't gone in that direction. In fact, compared to how things were under Veblen, the financial world has 1,000 times more power, at least 1,000 times more power than it had under Veblen in Veblen's day in the 19 teens and 20s. So basically, what Porter argued is that there are 5 key environmental factors. And he's not talking about institutions here. He's not talking about the government. He's not talking about regulation. He's talking about economic forces. So he gives a different view from the institutionalist. And he says that there are 5 important economic factors that affect how firms compete. How easy it is to enter the industry, ease of entry, how much, let's say, technical knowledge necessary. Second of all, substitutability, how unique is the product. Third of all, competitive rivalry, how many competitors there are and how cutthroat the competitors are. And then 4th and 5th are the bargaining power of suppliers and the bargaining power of buyers. And Porter argued that these 5 forces shape firms' responses, and firms respond in one of four ways that they either are cost minimizers, which your book mentions, the cost leaders, they are the cheapest. They differentiate their product. There's some unique product characteristic that enables them to form quasi-monopolies, or they are focused differentiators, which means that they differentiate their product, but it's targeted at a very narrow market on which they focus. So, for example, a firm that sells a unique kind of ethnic clothing is a focused differentiator. There's something unique about the clothing, and it's to a target market. A firm that sells the same kind of ethnic clothing, but is low cost, would be a cost-focused firm. So basically, those four strategies: cost differentiation, focused cost, and focused differentiation. Those four strategies are responses to the five forces, and so firms will compete. Now, what you can then say is that different organizational structures will be appropriate to these different strategies, but it's difficult to pin down. But what Chandler claimed, as I mentioned in the beginning, is that the contours of a market will drive the structure of the organization that the firm adopts. And firms sometimes have trouble dealing with it, dealing with how to adjust the structure of the organization. Your book also talks a little bit about the Miles and Snow typology. They don't mention Miles and Snow, but they talk about it a little. And basically, Miles and Snow argued that there are four types of competitors, four strategic forms that firms adopt. Prospectors look for new products, they innovate, they're innovative. Analyzers copy the prospectors. They analyze what's been done, and then they see what the prospector did wrong, and then they outcompete them. There are also defenders who have an established product, and they simply defend their market share. And then there are the fourth one is firms that are in declining markets and attempt to manage the decline. So basically, what your book says correctly, I believe they say, well, I'll tell you what's correct, is that the firms that tend to do the best are not the prospectors, but the analyzers. So usually, now this wasn't true of Apple, which innovated a great deal and has been successful at marketing. But if you look at Microsoft, a lot of what they did was simply copy other firms, but do it a little bit better, a little bit smarter. And the classic example, of course, is the DOS operating system and Windows, which other people had come up with first, and Microsoft copied or even stole DOS from somebody else, in the case of Windows also, and yet produced a product that more people wanted, which made them dominant in that market, in the operating system market, which they continue to have a huge impact on. Although Apple's come back with the iPhone, I'm using an Apple now, and I have to say it's just not, the technology isn't quite as good as the Microsoft technology. I mean, there's reasons why people prefer Apple. I know I don't want to get into a debate about it, but my experience of it is that they let out what Microsoft can do. Okay, one last point, and then we'll call it a night. We're just on time. Is that national culture will affect people's reactions to organization structure, and also the nature of organization structure. I mentioned the Japanese corporations that adopted Theory Z that pioneered lean manufacturing and total quality management, which maybe I'll talk about next time when we talk about culture. TQM is not really a culture, but I think it's related to organizational culture. One of the things that Auchi recognizes in Theory Z is that the Japanese firms had extraordinarily strong organizational cultures. They're much, much stronger than the United States organizational cultures. And there's nothing quite like it elsewhere in other companies. I don't believe the Chinese firms have pursued this anywhere. And I don't believe the German firms, many of which are also quite excellent, as are many American firms, produce products we use every day, Bayer aspirin and Mercedes-Benz cars and so on and so forth. They're all great countries and they've all produced great manufacturing, but the organizational cultures do have different tendencies in different countries. Americans tend to be more performance oriented. We tend to think shorter term. The Germans tend to be more engineering oriented. They have more conservatism, more stronger lines of control, probably better engineering. The Japanese are really strong on quality, and these kinds of differences spill over into the way the organizations are structured and how people relate to organizational structure. So one thing your book points out that in countries that have a lot of power distance, in other words, that accept authoritarianism, accept authority, that are authoritarian cultures, that these cultures tend to be more comfortable with mechanistic organizations, whereas cultures like ours, which are more entrepreneurial, tend to favor more organic forms of organization. So on that note, we'll say goodnight. So your paper is due on the 23rd, and have a nice Thanksgiving. And I will give out the exam on the 4th. If there are any other questions, feel free to ask before you leave. No questions? Okay, I'm not, maybe my microphone's broken, but I'm not hearing anything.
No, it's
Your
all good.
microphone's
Have a
not
good night.
Have a good night, everybody. Have a nice holiday.
Professor, I have a question.
Okay,
So I basically I emailed you my paper, check it up and give me feedback based on it, but you haven't emailed me back any response back.
I apologize. Did you send me the paper? Let me look for it.
Can you look for it right now? Let me know.
Which email did you send it to?
Same email you sent it to me.
Okay, let me look for that. I'll get back to you tonight.
All right, thank you so much. Then have a good day then. I mean, a good night.
Anyone else?
Professor.
Have a
good
night.
You too. Have a good night. Yes, Stephen.
Yeah, so I emailed you and you got back to me. Thanks. The DB post, like some of them they've disappeared. So I can't literally the link isn't available for.
Oh, it's over. I was thinking you were from another class. All right, I see what you mean. Okay. Yeah, okay. So in other words, you had posted and then you meant to change it and you weren't able to change it. Is that what happened?
No, I click save draft twice for 2 DB posts instead of clicking submit. And I didn't check the grades until recently, right?
I
So
got it.
basically I
Okay.
sent you proof that I did
Don't
it on
understand.
time.
Okay, I don't quite get what happened there. All right, so I'll look at what you did and adjust your grade.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Anyone else? Anyone else? Questions? 6-1? Nobody? Okay. All right, if you're still on board, have a nice holiday. And I will see you in 2 weeks.